UFC Fight Night São Paulo wasn't the best night for the people of Brazil, as some of their biggest stars took losses home on the night. The card's main story featured the return of the Dragon Lyoto Machida, who went toe-a-toe against the number 7 ranked middleweight Derek Brunson. Whilst his return did not turn out the way he wanted it to, the card itself featured some great fights and delivered to the fans for the most part. With another fight night card delivered, many questions were also answered on the night, so let's take a look at 5 things we learned from UFC Fight Night 119.1. The sport is evolving extremely fast. It was already known to the world that MMA was one of the fastest evolving sports out there. Since the beginning of UFC in 1993, the sport has been on a rapid incline, experiencing massive growth in the levels of the game. And Brunson vs. Machida only solidified this statement. Machida is a considerable legend in the sport, but since he has left his last footmark in 2015, the sport has never stopped rising to new levels. And tonight, as short as the fight lasted, it was only a matter of time before Brunson caught Machida and put him down. Machida, at the age of 39, may be a living legend, but the sport doesn't care about the career status of a fighter. It only matters where you are at currently, and Machida's game proved to be far too behind the current level of the sport. Point 2. Like him or not, Colby Covington is a legitimate contender. I'll be the first to say when Colby Covington called out Tyron Woodley after beating Dong Hyun Kim in his last fight, I wasn't convinced nor impressed. Arguably Kim was on the downside of his career, and while I was quite surprised to see Kim get dominated by this up-and-coming fighter, I thought it was too early for him to face a competition in top 5. But tonight, he proved to be one of the elites in the sport, as he edged out Demian Maia, who was on a run as impressive as any in the welterweight division before he ran into Woodley at UFC 214. Thank you at Demian Maia for the war. We should have got fight of the night. Respectpic.twitter.com 6YAWE1C. Colby Covington at Colby Kovma, October 29, 2017. The first round may not have been so pretty for Covington, but he showed world-class conditioning, prodigious takedown defense, and impressive discipline that allowed him to stay composed after arguably losing the first round. For sure with this win, Covington will be entering top 5 in the division, and once again the welterweight division has experienced another massive change tonight. It is hard for anyone to deny Covington now, especially considering the fact that he calls out those that not many would dare to call out in the division, which he deserves a lot of props for. Point 3. John Lineker is still a threat at 135 pounds after being completely outclassed in his last fight against the now title challenger TJ Dillashaw. It was an intriguing question for the fans to ask, how would Lineker bounce back tonight? He looked as good and composed as any of his fights, as he showed his durability and improved discipline to beat Marlon Vera via unanimous decision. With the bantamweight champion Cody Garbrandt defending his championship for the first time next week against Dillashaw, Lineker made the division a whole lot more interesting now, as he could be in position to fight a top 3 fighter once again. His most likely next matchup will be the loser of Dominic Cruz vs. Jimmy Rivera, which goes down at UFC 219 in December, and with one more win he could undoubtedly make his case for a title shot. Point 4. Demian Maia, is it time to call it quits? It was 2 fights in a row that Maia was quite simply completely shut down by a superb wrestler. Maia, at the age of 39, is considered to be the only real specialist left in MMA. However, we all saw at UFC 214 that Maia's style simply isn't well-rounded enough to beat the champion Tyron Woodley. And now, after losing in a very similar fashion to Colby Covington, it is definitely not out of the realm of possibility for Maia to consider hanging the gloves up. With the division as stacked and deep as it has ever been, it is hard to see Maia's one-sided style having much success with how fast everyone's game is evolving. Point 5. It's time to put some respect on Derek Brunson's name. Brunson has had ups and downs in his career, but one certain thing is that he's as good as he's ever been, and still improving. His knockout power has never been a secret to anyone, but to watch him knock out Machida the way he did was extremely impressive to watch. Brunson's game has also added on one crucial skill since his loss to Robert Whittaker: patience. We saw Brunson recklessly rushing Whittaker, only to be knocked out in the first round. Since then, he's stepped his game up, and arguably won his fight against Anderson Silva at UFC 208, and then followed that fight up with 2 first-round knockouts. Obviously, with his wrestling always being in his back pocket, Brunson's game is as good as any in the middleweight division, and anyone who he's going to fight in the future will have a tough time having success. Agree, disagree? Let us know below. 2016 was a phenomenal year for the UFC. The sport finally broke into New York for the first time. We saw the first ever fighter to hold two titles simultaneously, and in general, it featured some of the most exciting moments in the history of the company. Just off the top of my head, I can name several great fights that occurred in 2016.2017 HASNT exactly followed up. Especially the beginning of the year was quite rough for the UFC, as UFC 208 and 209 didn't live up to the expectations. And while you can say that things have turned around since, it's still difficult to compare this year to the previous. But don't write off 2017 just yet, because the real excitement is just beginning. Yes, I realize that it's almost November and there are only 3 PPVs left in the year. But it's not about the quantity of the PPVs, it's about quality. These last 2 months of 2017 has a schedule as good as any 2 months in the past. Let's start off with next week. Georges St-Pierre will finally make his long-awaited return to give his best effort at capturing the middleweight title from Michael Bisping, and Cody Garbrandt will make his first title defense in almost a year against his old friend yet bitter enemy, TJ Dillashaw. Not to forget the third title fight on the card, which makes Joanna Jędrzejczyk's attempt at 6th title defense and improving her record to 150 against Rose Namajunas. We can talk about the card without the title fights and it is just as good, as it features some incredible fights like Stephen Thompson versus Jorge Masvidal, Mickey Gall versus Randy Brown, and Ovince St. Preux versus Corey Anderson, just to name a few. Then the calendar moves to UFC Fight Night Poirier versus Pettis, which also features great fights apart from the main event. Matt Brown will be appearing in the final fight of his long career against Diego Sanchez. Joe Lauzon will be in a what is likely to be a fight of the night contender against Clay Guida, and other big names are featured on the card, including Andrei Arlovski and Nate Marquardt. Between this fight night card and UFC 218, Anderson Silva will square off against Kelvin Gastelum. The two were previously scheduled to fight at UFC 212, but Gastelum was pulled from the card after testing positive for marijuana. Also, the UFC will crown their first female flyweight champion on Ultimate Fighter Season 26 finale, where the entire show was dedicated to crowning a new flyweight champion alongside the coaching of Eddie Alvarez and Justin Gaethje. Speaking of Alvarez and Gaethje, they have their opportunity to put on a show at UFC 218, a card that will be headlined by Max Holloway defending his newly won featherweight championship for the first time against Frankie Edgar. The card also features a very conspicuous heavyweight bout between former title challenger Alistair Overeem and a rising wrecking machine Francis Ngannou. With Stipe Miocic being on such a tear since winning his championship, this fight will likely determine the next #1 contender. Other big attractions on the card include Henry Cejudo versus Sergio Pettis, Tisha Torres versus Michelle Waterson, and Al Iaquinta versus Paul Felder. Then the month of December just gets better and better. There will be 2 incredible fight night cards, one featuring an extremely intriguing fight between Cub Swanson and Brian Ortega, and the other being the possible best fight night card in the history of the promotion, at UFC Winnipeg. Swanson gets ready to take on yet another fighter outside of top 10, and seeing how exceptional Ortega looked in his last fight, it should be a barn burner. UFC Winnipeg may as well be a PPV card, as it features so many PPV-deserving bouts. Robbie Lawler and Rafael dos Anjos will fight to try and declare themselves a #1 contender, while the former champion Jose Aldo makes his return for a rematch against Ricardo Lamas. Santiago Ponzinibbio and Mike Perry will both try to climb up the welterweight ladder by fighting each other, and Glover Teixeira makes his return against Misha Cirkunov. If you think now that the rest of the year will be incredible, then just hold your emotions just a bit longer, because it's not quite over yet. UFC 219 will mark the end of the year, and whilst the card is still without a main event, just look at the list of fights currently scheduled for this event. Dominic Cruz vs Jimmy Rivera bantamweight bout, Cynthia Calvillo vs Carla Esparza strawweight bout, Carlos Condit vs Neil Magny welterweight bout, Khalil Roundtree Jr. vs Gokhan Saki light heavyweight bout, Kamaru Usman vs Emil Meek welterweight bout, Dan Hooker vs Mark Diakis lightweight bout, Luis Smolka vs Mateus Nicolau flyweight bout. Wow! Could it get any better? And yes, you saw it correctly. The card is still without a main event. If you already wrote off 2017 as a disappointment, you've made a premature decision. Like Tony Ferguson's walkout song's name says, the party has just begun. Dan the Hangman Hooker will make his 8th UFC appearance when he squares off against Englishman Mark Bone Crusher Diakis at UFC 219 in December. The lightweight bout will take place at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas on a card where the main event has yet to be announced. It's official at Mark Diakie's United Kingdom heads to UFC 219 in Las Vegas to face Dan Hooker, New Zealand on December 30. Pic.twitter.com Dix Booker, UFC Europe at UFC Europe October 24, 2017 New Zealand-born Hooker has alternated between wins and losses thus far in his UFC career. However, he is coming off a notable TKO victory over Ross Pearson on home soil earlier this year in Auckland. The fight was Hooker's first in the lightweight division, as all his previous bouts in the UFC had been at featherweight. Hooker looked flawless in his performance against the seasoned veteran Pearson, where he landed a vicious knee to win by KO in round 2. It's no surprise to see the Kiwi stick around 155 pounds and as he goes for back-to-back wins for the first time in the octagon. While Hooker looks for a second consecutive victory, Mark Diakis aims to avoid 2 straight losses. The 24-year-old had his momentum derailed on his last visit to Sin City in July, losing a split decision to Draker Klose. He started in the UFC with 3 consecutive wins that included a 30-second first-round KO and a TKO win on his debut in his hometown of Manchester. This time last year, Diakis tends not to waste too much time in the cage, with 6 career wins coming within the first round. Both fighters are notable up-and-coming prospects in their respective countries, and the contest has the potential to be standout on the card. Dan Hooker has great versatility and has a proven record of finishing fights by submission or knockout. While arguably not as well-rounded as Hooker, Diakis will be the more powerful and aggressive of the two and will likely attempt to dictate the pace of the fight. A win for either man will mean a significant step towards the elite top 15 at lightweight, especially on a big stage, that being the UFC's marquee final pay-per-view of the year. UFC Fight Night 119 is approaching this Saturday, and most of the attention is on the main and co-main events. While Derek Brunson vs. Lyoto Machida and Damian Maia vs. Colby Covington are exciting fights, there is another fight on the main card that deserves some attention. Kicking off the main card is a bantamweight matchup between Marlon Vera and 5 John Hands of Stone Lineker. Marlon Vera, who is 10-31 in his professional career, is coming off of an 8-month stretch of 3 wins in the octagon. After defeating Ning Guangyu in November of 2016 by unanimous decision, Chito followed that up with a huge upset win over Brad Pickett in his farewell fight in London. Vera had a quick turnaround and fought again 3 months later in July at UFC on Fox Weidman vs. Gastelum, where he submitted Brian Kelleher in the very first round via armbar. John Lineker, on the other hand, is a different story. His last fight would have elevated him to a title shot with a win, but he ended up with a unanimous decision loss to former champion TJ Dillashaw. He would have truly earned that shot too, before losing at UFC 207. Lineker had won 4 straight fights since moving up to bantamweight. This included wins over names like Rob Font, Michael McDonald, and John Dodson. John Lineker broke his jaw in the first round of his matchup with Dillashaw, but didn't end up needing surgery. He initially intended to return in July but ended up waiting until October to return. John Lineker vs. Marlon Vera is a great matchup. To this Fight Night card, Vera has a chance to get another huge win that could propel him into the rankings. Fighting in his opponent's home country is obviously not something that affects him, as he defeated Brad Pickett in England. He has proven in his last 2 fights that he has the skills to get it done with his striking, and also has a great submission game. Vera has a 5-inch height advantage that could really help distance himself from Lineker's power. John Lineker is small for a bantamweight, and this could factor into this matchup. However, he does have 29 professional wins and has shown the ability to take an absolute beatdown and not slow down. Prediction: when the main card kicks off this Saturday, it will be an important fight for the bantamweight division. While Vera offers lengthy striking and a good ground game, I see Lineker's experience and toughness to earn him a victory. John Lineker took some of the biggest shots TJ Dillashaw had to offer and even fought 2 rounds after breaking his jaw. This toughness will allow him to take some shots from Vera, before landing a big one of his own. My prediction: John Lineker by second round KO. Who do you think will have the first victory of the main card this Saturday?